Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sefer Chatter podcast, and kind of a bonus episode, if you will. On this episode of the podcast, going to be joined once again by R Moshe Maimon. He's been a guest on the podcast a number of times. And we'll be discussing the Legacy Judaica. Their 11th auction is coming up. We'll be discussing the auction catalog, various items from the catalog that we found interesting, and various items of historical interest. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Legacy Judaica. So full disclosure of that. And I've done this in the past, about probably 2 years ago, I think was the last time we did it. R Moshe came on as well, and we discussed a different auction. But we got good feedback after that. We haven't done it since. So, especially maybe some new listeners now as well. So if you're a new listener, if there's something new, what you think of this, and an old listener, I had people request then, hey, wanted to do this again. So, if anyone enjoys it or doesn't, let me know. Email me, swarmchatter@gmail.com. Okay, so without further ado, thank you, R Moshe, for joining me.
Thank you very much, Nachi. Yes, it was a lot of fun last time. This may be a little bit different than your typical podcast. Instead of doing a deep dive into one topic, we'll do more, a broad array of smaller nuggets on a lot of different svarim. So some people may like the Likutei Basar Likutei aspect instead of learning the Ian, one of those other very interesting svarim that you often talk about. Also, in interest of full disclosure, let me mention that I have a little bit of an association with Legacy Judaica. I go back with Rabbi Yehuda Schwartz a long time. This is his auction house. I still do some part-time consulting for them, do rabbinic research. So it's always a pleasure to work with Yehuda and Legacy. They're fantastic. And in this industry, they are very honest, which is not, can't take that for granted, unfortunately. But we're dealing with Yehuda, always above and beyond, straight like an arrow, and a wonderful person to deal with all the time. And these auctions keep getting better. His schire is terrific, and something for everybody.
I'll point out, like you said, you are someone involved with them, but Legacy approached me, not you. And being that you've been on the podcast a number of times, we're friends, you did this in the past, I approached you to come on here, and yes, we went through the catalog a little bit over Yom Tif, and we have some things to discuss. So with that, I will try to mention the lot numbers with the item so you can check it up. Obviously, the link, I should have mentioned this, the auction is on Sunday, April 23rd at 1 p.m. It's online. Legacy Judaica, and it's on BitSpirit, as well as it'll be live actually in Lakewood in Estreia. So for those interested in attending a live auction, a lot of auctions are in Eretz Yisrael or New York. People listening to this in Lakewood, you can attend the auction just if you just want to see how things are, or if you want to bid, do online. So that's something that's interesting and unique as well about this auction, that you really can go and see this stuff and actually be there when it goes on. So if it does interest you. And so like I said, we'll mention the lot number besides for the description, and in the show's notes I will try to put links to each item, so there'll be a link to Legacy's catalog, but the items that we discuss I will try to put individual links that you could just go, and again, just if you want to check them out or if you want to bid on them. To bid, I think if you don't have a BitSpirit account, you create an account and then you can bid, for those that aren't familiar with that.
I should point out as well that it's certainly worth your while, if you're a listener, looking at the online catalog, or if you have a print catalog, because there's no way we can mention all the items. We can't even go through just the important ones or the expensive ones, or we just it's going to be very topical, just picking the ones that caught our eye as we flip through the catalog. But there's very many more items that are sure to be of great interest that we just cannot cover due to the time constraints.
And I'll mention there's 247 lots, and if you're familiar or if you're not familiar with auction catalogs, they're interesting in of itself. Some people like the catalogs, some are better than others, obviously, but they're glossy paper, they're produced nicely, and especially when there's letters and things like that, they're fully reproduced. So for a few dollars you get a catalog, or once you, I think, BitSpirit, you bid, or if you wasn't, they send it for free to a lot of people. They're pretty easy to get them, and you can just own the catalog, and you can see these letters that we'll discuss, some letters and some other things, and you can just have that. So and if not, just enjoy, and like I said, I'll say it again in the beginning for any feedback. Okay, so we'll run through it. So I think the first thing that caught my eye, somewhat interesting, is lot 9 is Meir Tehillos. Meir Tehillos is a commentary on Tehillim of Meir Arama. So Meir Arama is the son of Lakewood Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak Arama, who wrote the Akedas Yitzchak, which is a famous commentary on Chumash, and he has some on the Chamesh Megillas. Interestingly, some on Chamesh Megillas, I'm not remembering offhand which ones, are misattributed to Yitzchak Rama. They're really his son, Meir Rama. It's been corrected recently, but anyways, so there was a new edition of Akedah done by Oz Vahadar a number of years ago. They redid the old commentary that was there. It has like, I don't know if it's Yiddish or Yiddish Deutsch there in some of the words. It's by Pollack. But it's a nice print, and they broke it up and they put little headers. But recently, actually very recently, as of this recording, it only came by air, not by boat. There was a brand new 800, almost 800. Sorry, it's not 800 pages. It's 763 page biography, intellectual biography of the Akedah, written by Rabbi Seewald, and he really goes through it. It was published through Oz Vahadar. I believe that Oz Vahadar is actually working on a Mavur Akedah for those interested. Anyway, so he talks a lot. There's a bunch about Rameir in here, and it's interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, we'll talk a little bit about the next lot 10, which is Nachlas Avos of the Abarbanel. Now, it's very interesting that the Abarbanel is right next to Meir Rama, because Meir Rama was born a couple of decades before the Gerush Sfarad, before the expulsion in 1492, and he, when they after the expulsion, the Akedah, Yitzchak Rama, and his son Meir, they ended up in Naples, where the Abarbanel ended up as well. And it seems like the Abarbanel would frequent the Akedah's home. I believe he knew him from before as well, and he would learn with him, or they would talk in learning. And at a certain point, the Akedah was nifter, and his farm were published later. But what's interesting is the Abarbanel, for those that are familiar with the Abarbanel, quotes extensively from the Akedah. I think at some point maybe like word for word, but it's extensively. But he does not attribute anything to the Akedah. And there was a letter published later on that Meir Rama kind of took the Abarbanel to task, and he accused him of stealing, that he stole from his father, and he never, he didn't say it was his father. It's Geneva. It's a very, very strongly worded letter, and it's in this new biography. It's quoted on page 518. So it's pretty. It's a pretty strong letter. You can see it there, and there's also the biography of Meir Rama on page 158. So again, it's interesting that they have Meir Rama next to the Abarbanel. But I will say, just for the listeners of the podcast or those interested, I did an episode a while back with Professor Cedric Cohen-Scally, who wrote a biography of the Abarbanel in Hebrew, as well as it's been translated into English. And we discussed this letter with him. And as I recall, listeners can listen to it, he said that while this may be true that the Abarbanel took from the Akedah, there's various, I think theories of why he didn't say him by name. He wasn't necessarily trying to steal. He didn't quote contemporaries or whatever the reason was. In this new book, Rav Zayvel, they talk about it. But he says that Abarbanel is a novel work on Chumash. It's not just a plagiaristic, rip-off, chas v'shalom, that he doesn't, didn't know what he was talking about. So it's just interesting. But that's interesting to know about Meir Rama. Now, I will also mention this commentary, Meir Tehillos, has also been redone by Oz Vahadar about a year and a half ago in 2 volumes, Mavur. So for those interested in the new one. So that's a little bit about the new edition and about Yitzchak Rama and those sort of things. I don't know, Ramesh, if anything to add.
It is ironic that the B'moisem Le'nifredu, here they are on the same page after they were together in life and struggle, and here they are again. Each Sefer is independently interesting as well. The Nachlas Avos is the Abarbanel's Kiryas Avos, which is it has the Abarbanel's stamp of originality, of course, and it also has a very nice introduction, which while some of his introductions deal with historical topics, this particular introduction deals with the Rambam's. It's a point-by-point dialogue with the Rambam's Hakdama, where he talks about the Seder of the transmission of the Hatakas Hashmua, and he goes, he quibbles with individual points and also on the general outlook. So it's a work worthy of its own individual study as well. What jumped out at me when I was looking at this introduction again was that he at one point he's talking about the different kind of commentaries on Avos, and he says how fitting a certain genre of dissecting the individual members of the Tanoim and sourcing them in different Gemaras and Psukim, he mentions that there are 3 that have done already a very good job in that, and he lists them Rabbeinu Yaina, Rabbi Yitzchak HaYisraeli, and Rav Matasyahu HaYitzhari. And just struck me as very, very interesting that of those 3, the only one that was really studied after that for the next 500 years was Rabbeinu Yaina, which was printed and of course very popular Pirush. But the other 2, just came out in the last generation or so. They were virtually unknown for 500 years, but in the times of the Abarbanel, these were the standard. These were the classics. Just amazing how the world works that way.
Yeah, it's an interesting commentary. Like I say, it's pretty classic of Abarbanel. I was flipping through at the new edition where he quotes these Mefarshim and other with the Rambam. There's a lot of things, and then I open the Mishnah Vav and he's quoting Seneca. He just right away he's quoting many different people and commentaries, so to speak, in this Pirush. It's pretty long, classic of Abarbanel. So it was printed, I think, in his lifetime. Actually, he says his son Shmuel asked him to write it. He wrote it in 1496. I think it was printed with some others from in Constantinople. It's actually Professor Yaakov Shmuel Spiegel, who publishes many manuscripts. He put out a new edition of Chasdei Avos, I think it's called, on Pirkei Avos with David Provençal, or Moshe Provençal's brother, who was one of the Gedolim in Italy in the mid-16th century. And he talks, somehow he gets off on his one of his classic tangents in there, and he talks about why the Abarbanel, who was living in Venice, chose to print his work in Constantinople when Venice was one of the print capitals. Even it's a little, maybe predates Bamberg, but it's kind of interesting. So there you can read some about it. This was printed. So there's actually two new editions. One is easier to get than others. One is by Oren Golan. He's printed a lot of works of the Abarbanel. And the other one is a beautiful edition. I mean, that one is very nice. But there's a beautiful edition by Yad Rav Nisim, which is pretty hard to get. You can get from Eretz Yisrael. It's a very, very nice edition. And that is lot 10. I would note as well, I know so far I've already mentioned new editions, but I feel like I don't only want to talk about the catalog. Once we're here, we can use this as a springboard to talk about interesting historical nuggets and Sfarim, being that this is Sfarim chatter. So there's that. Okay, so now we're going to flip through. I think Ramesh had something to say maybe about the Chuvas Ramban.
Chuvas Ramban, yes. Lot 19. It's the first edition of one of the volumes of Chuvas HaRajba. At the time it was published, it was called the Chuvas of the Ramban, because the Ramban is mentioned a few times early on. And the Chuvas, so the whole volume became known as the Chuvas HaRamban. Later, when people figured out that this is the Chuvas HaRajba, they would call it the Chuvas HaMeyuchasais LeHaramban. And that phrase kind of stuck, and every time I hear it, it sticks in my craw, because Meyuchasais means excellent pedigree. And it's used exactly the opposite in the opposite sense, where it means a mistaken attribution. So, when they call them Miyuchasais LaRamban, these are not Miyuchas at all to the Ramban. These are falsely attributed to the Ramban. So that's an item worth just mentioning. But the Sefer itself is a classic. It's the first edition of this particular volume of Chuvas HaRajba, and it's one of Stefanski's Sefer Yesod. So it's a worthwhile item.
Yeah, this was printed in Venice, 1519. This copy is incomplete, so therefore it is cheaper, quote unquote. So if someone wants to own something from so not long ago. Now, one of the most beautiful things in this catalog is lot 22, which is Talmud Yerushalmi, complete set, a beautiful leather binding. It's first Yerushalmi in Venice, 1523. This was the subject of a recent podcast episode I did a few months ago with Dr. Yaakov Meir, who wrote a book in Hebrew, Tfus Rishon. It was published through Magnus Press, and talking about this first edition and how it came to be. It's actually a really, check out the podcast episode. Actually, and then also, for those who listen to Rabbi Dr. David Katz in his podcast, he also talked about these Yerushalmi. So it's interesting how Yerushalmi really comes from, just to summarize very briefly, it comes from one manuscript, the Leiden manuscripts today in the Netherlands. And kind of a rarity, we don't really have many of these manuscripts. They would take the manuscript and they would then work it over and publish the Sefer, and they would kind of throw it out. They didn't need it anymore. It was printed. But here we kind of have the working copy. We have the edits in the margin. It was edited by Yaakov ben Chaim ibn Adonio and David Pizikton, and we kind of have those notes. And again, all the Yerushalmi we have today, this is the only really complete manuscript. The Leiden manuscript, they had another one, and you can listen to the podcast or read the book where he kind of shows exactly what the manuscript says and what they ended up using and how they differ and how they're the same. I think Masechta Shkalim, if I remember correctly, was the Bavli. They printed it with Bavli, and then it was printed with Yerushalmi, and they made changes, and it's different. It's a very interesting thing, but this is that first original edition that they printed in Bamberg's press. It's printed in 1523.
Now, it's interesting because the nature of Jewish manuscripts, is the story of the Jewish people. They're copied and they move from place to place, and they're persecuted and they're confiscated. And unfortunately, a lot of them were destroyed over the years. So the end result is that on Talmud Bavli and on Talmud Yerushalmi, both, there exists only one complete manuscript that encompasses the whole Talmud. On the Talmud Bavli, it's the famous Munich manuscript, and on the Talmud Yerushalmi, it's the aforementioned Leiden manuscript. The major difference being that the Munich manuscript was not used in the production of the first edition of the Talmud Bavli, or even the classical, Sensino, or the Bamberg edition of Talmud Bavli. It wasn't used at all. It's important to us now, but it's not. It doesn't relate at all to the printed edition. Unlike the Leiden manuscript, which, as you said, was the working copy from which the print edition came, and it's one of the only such in the Jewish world, in the world of Jewish publishing, it's one of the only such instances where we have the manuscript from which the entire work was published. So it's a really fascinating thing, and I found very interesting in the book where he talks about the life of Yaakov ben Chaim ibn Adonio, because he has a very troubled history, eventually converting to Christianity, and Dr. Meir gives him some kind of psychoanalysis based on the scribblings that he put in the manuscript, where he diagnosed him as a very lonely fellow, out of place, and intellectually out of place, and physically out of place. So I found that to be very interesting.
Yeah, I think he was from Tunisia. He wasn't Italian. He ended up in Venice and worked, and also working with Nachlas Avos. He's the one, it's interesting. He ended up converting, but he's the Nachlas Avos, that whole layout. He was the editor. I don't know if it was his idea to lay it out. I think Jordan Pinkauer has about that, his dissertation on that as well. So that's lot 22. Now, again, as we said, as you can see, we're kind of flipping through. So now we'll jump to lot 32.
Lot 32 is a real classic. This is what put the Chafetz Chaim on the map. This is the Sefer Chafetz Chaim, published anonymously, very famously. We grew up all knowing that it was published anonymously. But interestingly, in this catalog, they point out that although it was reputed to be published anonymously, in the Russian letters at the bottom of the Sharblat, it does identify the author as what translates into English as I am Kagan. Now, I first learned about this many years ago from Shimon Steinmetz's blog, where he pointed this out, and he also added some context, saying that first of all, it's very likely that it was impossible to publish a book anonymously in the olden days because of the Russian sharp eye for censorship and whatever, and therefore it had to have an author on it. And even with the name I am Kagan, he points out the Chafetz Chaim was not known by the name Kagan. Kagan is just the Russian way of saying Kohen, and Kohen is like saying John Smith. So it did not really give away his identity. So that should be pointed out as well.
Now, some of these will make, I know we've been talking a bunch, but some of them we'll talk a little less. So I'll jump. Lot 39 is interesting. It's just a little bit interesting. It's a commentary in Shulchan Aruch by Aryeh Halevi Finzi. I don't know why they don't write his last name, but it was in the 17th century. But what's interesting about it is that the Sharblat, on the title page, he has 6 pictures, and there's 3 on each side. One is Rashi, Rambam, Maril, Marik, the Ramah, and then himself. And it has it's pictures of them. You should look at it in the catalog. It's interesting to see it. They say that the title page is rare. I don't know if that's the case or not, but that's what they say. But it's interesting to see how they kind of give each gadol. They look differently. They do look differently. They kind of, I don't know if it was based on where they were from or what the case kind of is, but you can check out the pictures.
It also shows you who was who in his intellectual world. Starting from Rashi and ending with himself. But along the way, the Maharik, obviously one of the great Italian at the end of Kufas Arishonim, one of the greatest Rabbanim there. It's the Rashi, it's the Rambam. So these are the people that are very important to Rabbi Finzi.
Yeah, so I would point out to that. Now we'll jump ahead to something that R Moshe told me that he found in here. So I'll give him the floor here. It's something that not mentioned in the catalog. So this is lot 45.
Yeah. So this is why. This should be a lesson for you. Whenever it says there's unidentified signatures or unidentified glosses, there may be a lot of value in those. So if you're a treasure hunter, that should alert you, especially if you have a good historical sense yourself and you can decipher the handwriting. You can often find a lot of treasures that were overlooked because let's face it, the auction house is in the business selling and buying and selling. They're not in the business of doing historical research and spending a lot of money and time on that. So very often these things will slip by, and this one I caught. So, but it's really interesting. When I was looking at these two unidentified inscriptions on the side of the two volumes of this lot 45. Lot 45 is the Kiryas Sefer. Kiryas Sefer is the Meiri's Sefer on Ksiva Sefer Torah and Kriya Sefer Torah. So that's why it's split into two volumes. The first part actually came out earlier in the 1860s, but then it was republished again in the 1880s, first part 1, and then a few years later, part 2. Now, these inscriptions, when I was able to read them with the help of my good friend Shlomo Dayan, he's very good at reading the Sephardic Ksav. So together we figured out that volume 1 is dedicated to none other than the Gadol Hador in Turkey at the time, which is Rabbi Avraham Palachi, son of Rabbi Chaim Palachi. Actually, the words Avraham Palachi you can actually make out. They're written in square Ashturi letters. They're not written specifically in Sephardic script. But the rest of it around it says that this is a gift to the Beis Medrash, which means to the home and the study hall of my father-in-law, Rav Chaim Palachi, the great Rav. He's my Rebbe, and it's signed Mikatane Emana, from those of little faith, which is a very weird way to sign your name. Even when you're signing, you're being humble. It's a weird way to refer to yourself as somebody of little faith. And then he says afterwards, Chasne v'Talmida, his son-in-law and his Talmud, which alerted me maybe Amana is not of small faith. Maybe he means that's the Rashi Tevis of his name. And you open the Sefer and you see the Sefer was published by Abba Moshe Nahar HaKohen, which his chidushim were included in the first edition of the Sefer, and he included his father's chidushim. So he was a big Talmud Chacham himself. He's the son-in-law of Rabbi Avraham Palachi in Turkey. He was a Rav himself in a small one of the suburbs of Izmir, and he's the one who published the Sefer, and he calls himself Miktanei Amana. So I found that to be fascinating. This is the author's, the publisher's own inscription giving the Sefer to his father-in-law, the Gadol Hador. The next one again uses the term. The next inscription is where the Sefer is gifted to his nephew, and he again uses the term at the end. He slips it in the Amana Rashi Tevis, and he doesn't put the Rashi Tevis apostrophes there, but that was his way of signing his name. Interestingly, I think the name, just for historical curiosity, I think the name Abba was added later, because in the first edition he just called himself Moshe Nahar without the Aleph before, and then that was in the first edition in the 1860s. Here in the 1880s, the first volume, it has Abba in Rashi letters, and then the rest of his name in square letters. But by the time the second volume comes around, it's already all in square letters. So I think that the name Abba was added at some point, and then by the time it took root, that was his name. And there's a tragic backstory why he published the Sefer again. It's because his grandson, who was a young Torah scholar engaged to be married, passed away tragically right before his marriage. So that spurred him to put out the Sefer from the Meiri again in the two volumes. So that's the backstory for this otherwise humble-looking lot 45.
Yeah, I'm not mentioning prices, by the way, because this will air and people have bid already. They're just opening bids here, and things have gone up and down. And it's also this podcast, people listen to this after the auction, maybe in the future, just because it's interesting. So, we won't mention it, but it does have low starting price, and it says unidentified. For Moshe mentioned, for those who aren't familiar with this, a lot of times if you aren't familiar, I'll explain. A lot of times in catalogs, they'll say unidentified inscriptions, unidentified glosses, unidentified this. But that makes the Sefer is cheaper because they don't know who it is. If they knew who it was, especially someone famous, it would cost more money. So here we have a case of maybe someone will go bid on this now, and it will end up costing more, even though the auction house put it lower because they didn't know who it was, and they were unidentified inscriptions.
Yes, later on in this catalog, you'll see for example, there's an Elia Rabbah with hundreds and hundreds of comments, which they say seemingly from the Beis Medrash of the Noda B'Yehuda. And they say that because they brought to experts who say that based on the tzura of the Ksav and the kind of Torah that it said, it seems like it comes from Prague in the late 17th, turn of the century, early 1800s, from that Prague. Now, they don't know who it was, and they couldn't spend, the time and the money figuring out who it was, but maybe somebody who has a sense for these kind of things can figure it out who it was, and even if not, these may be very, very valuable glasses. There's other such items which we may mention in passing along the way. So I think that's what the buyer who's interested in these things should look out for those kind of lots. Next thing next item that caught our attention is also a very famous classic. This is the Crazy Uplesi of Rabbi Yonis and Apeshitz. And this is a classic because from the moment it was published, it captured the hearts and minds of Bnei Torah, Talmud Chacham, Yeshiva people. It is a very, very classical Sefer. And I mentioned this once in the past, but it bears mentioning again. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the bitter nemesis of Rabbi Yonis and Apeshitz, he writes in his own memoir, in his Megillah Sefer, he comments on the publication of this Crazy Uplesi. And he says that now that the Sefer has been published, everybody will see that Rabbi Yonis and Apeshitz is worthy of ridicule because the Sefer is so meaningless and so worthless. And the exact opposite has been true. It's been proven the case that this has become an extremely popular Sefer. This is a classic, Shabbat classic. This particular edition was owned by an important Talmud Chacham previously, but the Sefer itself is a classic and worthy of interest.
I'll just make brief mention of Lot 51. It's Sefer HaOyin or Sefer HaOven. Not sure how exactly you pronounce it. I think Feivel Schneider, who writes the catalog, told me also he wasn't sure either. It's an interesting work. So Lot 51, printed in Vienna, 1796. It's like a commentary on language. I think there's Bechinas Olam as well in there. It's kind of an interesting work. But Rav Moshe Kunitz, he was a little bit interesting. Often in Budapest, he's famous for a work called Bar Yochai, about kind of a biography of Shimon Bar Yochai, but he was somewhat, I guess what he writes here in the, I'll read from the catalog. He was a somewhat interesting personality, as he was a great Talmudic scholar, as well as being fluent in secular studies and was familiar with members of the Enlightenment. So he's kind of an interesting fellow. Or Moshe, if you have something to add about Moshe Kunitz.
He's quite an interesting fellow, of course. This Sefer, I don't know that it's one of his more interesting Sfarim. I think this Sefer is actually largely unknown. It's not, this was published before he made the great waves that he did in the 1800s. But in the 1800s, he was very controversial because he lent his support to the early reform movement. And he's mentioned in their early in their Sefer Noiga, and he actually permitted, from a halachic perspective, he permitted the use of the organ in the shul, which imitated what was going on in churches, and that was seen as the reform's real break with rabbinic Judaism, and he permitted it. So I think personally, nobody doubted that he was a Talmud Chacham Yerushalmi, but they felt that he had crossed the line by being too close to them and lending too much credibility to them. Interestingly enough, in the response of the response to literature by Solomon Freehoff, who is a Reform rabbi himself, he talks about how he mentions how he was a strictly an Orthodox, and from his perspective, Kunitz was of course strictly Orthodox, and it does bear mentioning that although the Chassam Sofer was very critical of another similar, a different Orthodox rabbi in a similar position, that's Aaron Chorener, he would call him Acher, and he would denigrate him, but Moshe Kunitz was spared open denigration, probably because of his personal stature and his reputation for piety.
Yeah, so just an interesting, not an expensive work at all. Like I said, it's pretty kind of unknown.
Oh, the Shita Mekubetzes, that's another work right here. Yes, Lot 54. This is the first print of the Shita Mekubetzes. Of course, a very very good classic. The Shita Mekubetzes incorporated a lot of works of Rishonim before they were printed, and this is the way a lot of Talmidei Chacham learned about Rashbas and Rambans and Ritzvahs. But even now, even today, with the publication of all these Rishonim, there's still a lot of bridge work done by the Shita himself. Moving from one region to the next, asking a question, using some editorial insight. There's sources that we don't have today that we only know about through the Shita. One very interesting point to ponder when it comes to these editorial glosses of the Shita Mekubetzes is the report that the Shitas, or Betzalel Ashkenazi, worked on this in Egypt with his student, who later became very famous as the Arizal. The Arizal was a student of the Shitas back in Mitzrayim when he was still young and unknown, but he was a genius and a prodigy, and he helped the Shita Mekubetzes work through all these Rishonim, all these sugyas. The Chida mentions a first-hand account of a Shita Mekubetzes on Kachim written by the Arizal together with the Shita Mekubetzes, and there are some who claim that there's even hints in the Shita we have on Nashon Nezikin where the Arizal's fingerprints can be found. So that is the first publication in Nigla of the Arizal. It's an interesting side note to the famous Shita Mekubetzis.
I just want to mention a few lots here that I don't have anything to say on, just to mention them. Lot 30, there's a couple of yeshivish classics, for those interested. Lot 33, there's a first edition of Reb Chaim Alevi, Soloveitchik, and Rambam. Lot 57, you have a set of Ar Sameach. Lot 58 of Ar Tzafon, which is also. And then you have Lot 62, Ashar Yosher, Shemeshkap, a couple of those. I would also mention Lot 59 and 60 are two publications by Sarah Schneer. So for those interested, one of them, I think 59, has her picture and other pictures that was published in Lodge in 1933.
Her picture was not included in the catalog for those who are sensitive to such issues.
Or is that the other way? Why didn't they include the picture? They mentioned that the picture's there, but it's not included in the catalog. But it is included in the work. So that is worth mentioning. Now, there's a couple interesting ones here. Lot 66 is a Cherem on it's a Cherem on mixed dancing in 1800.
It's a very interesting thing. It shows you, it gives you a very good sense of the history of the times, and I like to mention this. And this highlights something which I all too often overlooked. We live today in for better or for worse, but we live in the post ghetto Jewish world where you have Orthodox Jews and you have less Orthodox Jews, more Orthodox Jews, you have non-Orthodox Jews, you have a lot of different factions, and we identify ourselves by our, in large part, by our degree of religiosity. That was not the case in the, when Jews were still in the ghettos and the entire Jewish community had to tolerate each other, whether they liked it or not, and there were a much wider array of religious affiliations within the largely religious community. And that's why communities that would ban mixed dancing today don't often have to deal with mixed dancing. But in this community, in this German city, this was a problem, and they had to try to stamp it out. And they write, they're coming down very strong on this episode of mixed dancing. Again, we're in kids; these are probably teenagers who in that time at marriageable age, and they were talking about the specific ceremony was when they were moving into a new shul building, and people were very festive. And then this mixed dancing broke out, and they had to come down very forcefully to ensure that this does not spread. So that was a concern in this kind of community at that time. Just this Shabbos, I was looking in the Sefer Meshivas Nefesh from Rav Yochanan Luria. Rav Yochanan Luria was a very important Rav in Germany from 500 plus years ago, and he's also talking about different challenges of the Yetzer Hara, and he mentioned something like that. He says, the women and men are there together by the Suda. They're and Beshitov doesn't just mean under the same roof. Beshitov really means Pshutvas. They're really together. Ubeshitov Harikud Hashir. They're really together during the dancing and the singing. And of course the women are dressed in their finery. The Kol Isha Erva, you have the problem. The women are singing and the men can hear them singing. So he rails against that practice. But again, this was a reality that these Orthodox communities, these Jewish communities, which meant Orthodox communities, had to deal with. And how did they deal with it? So this band tells you how they dealt with it. They would it lists all the people who were all the guilty parties, the male and female, it lists them, and it comes out very strongly that these parties will not be able to receive any communal honors for 6 months, not secular honors, not religious honors for 6 months. Communal honors, again, in these kind of in the ghetto, communal honors were everything. Everybody was they were living in very tight quarters, and everybody knew exactly who's getting what aliyah when and who got which title by whom, and it was very, very important to them in the social hierarchy and the social structure of this community. So such a harsh punishment to go 6 months without any communal recognition or honors was very, very strong. That's how it was perceived back then.
I'll point out that the catalog also says it's seemingly in Germany. In Germany, honors in shul was a big deal. I have other podcasts talk about this. Professor Deborah Kaplan talked about her work in charity in Germany, and Professor Edward Fram, we did a book on the diary, the court diaries of Chaim Gundersheim. I think we talked about it. It's like there's always people coming to Bezdin. They were very busy with the seats and with the aliyahs. It's like it was a very big deal in Germany. So it's a very interesting thing.
And we can't relate to that reality where you have 100 shuls to pick from and shtiebels, and you go Friday night to one place and another place, and there's always enough seats for whoever wants them, and if you send someone a seat, no big deal.
Yeah, now that's lot 66. I think it's just one page. Lot 68 is interesting. It's Dvar Shmuel, the Shuvas of Dvar Shmuel Avov. He was the Rav in Venice, one of the major Gedolim of the 17th century, and he was at the time of Shabtai Tzvi as well, and this is famous for when Nathan of Gaza ended up in Venice, and they got a hold of him and they forced him to sign on. Or much we have more to say. For those familiar, I'm pretty sure this came up in the Sfarim Chatter Shabtai Tzvi series, but then to this in the back of the Dvar Shmuel, there's a piece about Shabtai Tzvi. This work was redone recently, finally, by Zichron Aaron. This Shuvos was not redone since it was originally published in 1702. So it was just like photocopy. There's nothing redone till now.
I'm sure Abuav, like you said, he was the Gedolei Hador. He also gets the very rare approbation of the Yavitz. The Yavitz reports to hearing his father say, the Chacham Tzvi, that the Chacham Tzvi was always proud of the blessing he received as a child from Shmuel Abuav, and he attributed a lot of his success to that blessing. And the Yavitz says he was, for the Chacham Tzvi to say that about him, it must mean that he was extremely high up there on the hierarchy, really from the Gedolei Hador Mamish. And this, what is this item from Shabtai Tzvi doing in the back of the Dvar Shmuel? Well, the Dvar Shmuel, Shmuel Abuav, he was the chief of the Bezdin, which interrogated Nasan Hazati, Nathan of Gaza, when he was on this was after the apostasy of Shabtai Tzvi, and the movement was becoming a sectarian movement with Nathan at its helm. And when he was, on his, traveling through Venice on his way, they couldn't do anything to him because already there was a lot of Christian interest in the Sabbatian movement, which they felt can be a gateway drug, so to speak, to the Christian faith. So because they favored Nassim, there was very little that the Bezdin could actually do, but they did sequester him in a room and interrogate him and really hold his feet to the fire, so to speak, until he would sign a retraction of all his prophecies. The interesting thing is he writes, he signs Ani Nasan Ha'azati, and but the Chida reports hearing from the Ramaz, who was present, Rav Moshe Zakuta, he was present at this interrogation, and he says that upon closer look, the Aleph of Ani and the Nun Yud looked more like an Aleph Gimel, which stood for Eines Gomer, which is the parallel of there's a Latin formulation which Christians would use when they would sign something under duress. They would say coactus facie, which is they would put a CF. So that's the same thing as the Aleph Gimel meant Eines Gomer. This was the Nassan's way of saying that he was signing under duress. That's what the Chida reports. In the printed edition, you don't see that. You just see Ani Nasan Hazat.
So that's lot 68. Lot 69, I'll mention, is the making of a gadol, the original, uncensored, as they say, the original edition of 2002. We won't go into the whole Cherem, the whole story with the making of a gadol, but I will mention that just looking on Bid Spirit, the last time it was an auction was December 14, 2022. It sold for $1,500, and Legacy had it May 30, 2021. It sold for $1,200. So somehow it became a very expensive item. That is lot 69. Lot 70, I don't think we discussed this on a previous episode. Maybe that's Luchas Eidos, which is the famous controversy of Rebbeinu Eibish's Yaakov Emden. So this was published in 1755 in Altona. This was the controversy of Rebbeinu Eibish's Yaakov Emden lived in Au, Altona, Hamburg, Wandsbek, the triple community. And this was Rebbeinu defense. This is really the only thing that he published about the controversy.
This is it's quite an interesting sefer because the entire sefer consists of letters written to Rabbi Yonasan defending him and saying, that he's of course innocent from all charges. Rav Shneir Leinman, Rabbi Dr. Professor Shneir Leinman, great expert on the so-called Emden Eibish's controversy. He devotes a lot of attention to this particular sefer. He does say that this was the only, this was, like you said, this is the only publication. This is the only salvo fired back from Rabbi Yonasan. He says that most of the Rabbanim in the Sefer were those like younger who had been influenced by Rabbi Yonasan, but the old guard was pretty strong on the side of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. So do what you will with that. But this Sefer does collect a lot of signatures in favor of Rabbi Yonasan, and none more famous than the very last one, which is the Vilna Goyim. This is the first, and it's mentioned here in the catalog as well. This is the first published writings of the Vilna Goyim. The Vilna Goyim also came to the defense of Rabbeinu Yonah. Now again, this came out in 1756 or 1755 actually, when the Vilna Gaon was still only 35 years old and virtually unknown beyond the communities where he, Vilna where he was. And Rabbeinu Yonah introduces him by saying also in Berlin, where he had traveled on his famous Gullus. So wherever he had gone, people would speak wonders about him. But beyond that, virtually unknown, which is why Rabbeinu Yonah why he needs an introduction. And Rabbeinu Yonah introduces him as somebody that is a complete Bucky in Nigla and tenfold in Nistar. And the letter goes on. It's an interesting letter, and it's dissected by Schneer in a very fascinating and excellent article where he says, where the content of the letter is, where he addresses himself to the great Yerushalmi and He says, I received your kameos that you sent me to look over with your true explanations of them, and these are kameos that are rooted in holiness, but I apologize that I can't come to your defense much as I'd like to. And Sir Schneer asks, well, if he's writing that these are true and that they're rooted in holiness, why didn't he apologize? He didn't come to his defense if he just came to his defense. So he says this has actually troubled historians and scholars alike for a long time. What was Rabbi Yaakov Emden's own response to this? Rabbi Yaakov Emden wrote a Sefer, debunking, in his word, the Luchas Oven. Now, it's in the catalog. It's spelled Luchas Even, which is a common mistake. People think, Luchas Even, which is the Luchas that Moshe Rabbeinu brought down, are Luchas of stone, of Even, Aleph Vav Avez Nun. This is Aleph Vav Nun, Oven, like Poyale Oven. People who deal evil and misdeeds. So that's Shmiras Luchas Ha'oven. That's the name of this of Rabbi Yaakov Emden Sefer. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden devotes a lot of space to the more famous signatories in this Sefer, but he devotes 2 lines to the letter of the Vilna Gaon, who he did not know at the time. And these 2 lines, he says, he also has a little letter from an Ishbar, some foolish man from Vilna, a nar chaser leiv hameir al amitas k'meyosev u'pirashem, who says that they're true. Yala basham l'chein kol oizer k'maki u'sharasham kimal arsham asham. It's a rhyme that it's worthless. It's pointless to deal with this. Whatever they say in this entire book is full of delinquency. It's ridiculous. It doesn't even require any rebuttal. So that's just 2 lines that he gives to the Vilna Gaon, who he did not know. Later in 1769, when Rabbi Yaakov Emden already knows who the Vilna Gaon is, he's not quite so cavalier with it. And instead, he, in a Sefer his Avkus, he quotes a report told him by a trusted source, of course, that says that the Vilna Gaon protested that he never wrote this letter. It was forged. So what it says here in the catalog, this is the first publication of the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Yaakov Emden would have an issue with that. Dr. Lyman's take on this, he says, there's no other forged letter in this Luchas Edis, where we're able to compare the letters that he produced here with the letters, the original letters. It's pretty accurate. There are slight changes which reflect better. Slight words would be changed, and in all the cases they do reflect better on our various images. But more than that, he says there's no actual forgeries, so he doesn't think it's a credible claim to say this letter of the Vilna Gaon is forged. But what does stand out is the aforementioned problem that why would he apologize if he already came to their defense? I would add, it would make no sense to forge a letter from someone nobody even heard of. Like we said, the Vilna Gaon requires an introduction before his letter. Why would you forge a letter from an unknown person that you have to introduce? The whole thing doesn't make any sense. So I think it's you can discount that. It's not a forged letter. Were these words added in? Schneer advances another theory that maybe these are it was a stock phrase where Vilna Gaon is just using the words that were sent to him. I got what you call the Emesa Pirushim on the Kmeis Asher Yisrael Harikosh. So be that as it may, those are the 2 interesting theories advanced by Lyman, but it's a real absolute classic of a Sefer, this Luchas Edis. It's hard to find. It's of great historical interest.
That and I was just mentioning that is lot 70.
The next lot 71, is the Magim Vitzina of the Ramchal. There's a number of Ramchal items in this catalog. Lot 71 is the Magim Vitzina. Magim Vitzina is Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chaver's response to the attack on Kabbalah from the Ari Noyim of Yehuda Ari of Madana, which is a fascinating subject of an earlier podcast you gave, and probably do some more on him as well because he's that interesting. He voiced his reservations, shall we say, about Chachmas HaKabbalah, and that was taken on by a lot of the big Gaonim throughout. So this is it's Rabbi Yitzchak Chavar's Sefer, in which he includes rules of Kabbalah from who he says Me'ish Oisei Pella Hamaforsim L'Shem Tehila Noira Alila Harav Hakadosh Hachosid Eliki Moyarav Moshe Chaim L'Tzad Zechet Tzad L'Kosh L'Bracha. These are maybe at this point these are the most honorifics that Ramchal has received in the Ashkenazic world. You compare it to Lot 84, which is the original Derech Hashem, the first print Derech Hashem. There's like no honorifics there. You can compare it to Lot 95, which is the first print of his Sefer Higoyin, where it calls him HaChacham HaNala. Interestingly enough, in the Sefer Higoyin, it says it says his name, and it says the Nun Reish Vav, Natri Rachmanu Parke, which is always used for someone that's alive. This was published well after his death, 150 years after his death. So to me, it's quite interesting that stuck there, that Natri Rachmanu Parke. I don't know, but you just compare these other lots, and you see how, particularly when they're using him, the Ramchal, to defend the faith, he gets his reputation only grows by leaps and bounds. That's Lot 71, the Magid Metzina. Lot 72, a very interesting sefer, especially for those interested in the early American Rabbanis. This is a sefer of Rosenberg, a sefer on machine matzah. Quite an interesting topic for that be taken on in America. In America, there were a lot bigger issues with Shabbos and Kashrus and Gittin and everything. But this Rabbi Rosenberg, who arrived in St. Louis, was quite an interesting fellow himself. He had a reputation as a medicine man. He didn't have any degrees, of course, but he would buy the ingredients and he'd mix the potions, and he developed a reputation as someone that can give you a good dose of something when as needed. He came to St. Louis. He was the rabbi there for about 25 years or so. At the time, there was one of America's more famous rabbanim, Rav Shalom Elchanan Yafi, was the Rav in St. Louis. Later became the Rav of the Beis Medrash on Norfolk Street in New York. A very famous rabbinical personality. And right away, as the rabbis in America would do, is he got into a fight over Gittin, had to spell the city of St. Louis, and other things. So one issue he took on was the machine matzah. Now, interestingly, this sefer was not on Hebrew books or on Eitzar Chachma. You got to do some digging to find the sefer. It's not a common sefer, but this is a sefer where he talks about machine matzah, largely to limit the use of machine matzah, but not to straight out say it's usher, but to give a whole list of restrictions, how and when and what to be done, to make it to sharply curb the mass production of the machine matzah. Now, it didn't make everybody happy. There's a letter there from the father of the Minchas Elazar and the Darchei Tshuva. The Darchei Tshuva of Monkash, he says, I can't give a haskam on your sefer if you're not going to say it's usher, because I'm a Talmud of the Divrei Chaim, and machine matzah is chametz, and where I come from. So, you didn't go far enough. Other Rabbanim felt maybe he's a little too strong. They took some issues, some halachic issues, but it's a lot of interesting haskamas. It's a very fascinating sefer. At the end, he has the opinion of some secular experts on whether fans actually cool down the surface that they blow on, or they just give that impression. So he wrote to the University of Washington University, which was in St. Louis. He wrote to a professor there. He wrote to the Smithsonian, and then he included their letters in English with his own Hebrew translation afterwards, where they confirm what he had claimed, that the fans only make you feel cool because they dry the moisture, but they do not actually change the temperature, which has an effect on the production of the matzah.
Talking about machine matzah, the controversy, if anyone's interested in more, we'll mention the excellent series Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brot on Old Daf has on this. And interestingly, just because there's this most recent episode I did on the podcast, posted with Dr. Akiva Sternberg about the halachic issues in the immigration to America between 1850 and 1924. As you mentioned, the issues in America. This was not one of the most pressing issues of Shimatzah, but this is something in St. Louis that was printed in 1903, Lot 72. Lot 74 is the Forge Yerushalmi on Kachim, just part 2. This is Shlomo Friedlander El Ghazi. The previous podcast we did about an auction, we did discuss this. There was a full set, there's part set. So just mentioning that one part of it is in here. We'll discuss maybe more notorious, more notorious, but this is more notorious, but another forgery later on, perhaps forgery a little bit later.
I will say something that just caught my eye recently when I was reading through Tzvi Binyamin Auerbach's introduction to his edition of Sefer HaEshkol. he throws out, which again, on the topic of forgery, he's been accused of forging the Sefer. He has his defenders who say he would never do such a thing. Maybe he was misled by a bad manuscript, whatever it was. But certainly there were people who thought of him as a forger. And I wonder if there's a connection here, because he writes in his introduction in a footnote, a lengthy footnote, that he heard that the Vatican has a copy of the Yerushalmi HaKodshim, and he advises someone to go and redeem it and rescue it and publish the Yerushalmi HaKodshim, and that person will merit great fame and earn the thanks of Talmid Chacham everywhere. So maybe those words fell into Friedlander's ears and took root. Who knows? But I just found that to be very interesting, something I just saw recently.
Now, at this point, I'll mention that it's starting with, I believe it is, let me just find it here, lot 76, the Sefer Chasidus and Kabbalah. It's kind of mixed up. Somehow they put Kabbalah, even put I think Derech Hashem is a section, and I don't know why that's doing here, but Sefer Chasidus and Kabbalah. So I am not an expert on that. And Ramesh, I don't want to speak for you, but you told me I don't think you're an expert on this
It's
either.
not my expertise. I mean, it's clear that there are some very, very important items here. Even without being an expert, you know that the first edition of Tanya's and the different versions of the Tanya's, and there's a lot of other things from the Alter Rebbe here. So there are some real important Hasidic works here, clearly. So it's certainly worth your while looking through this lot. I don't know all these, again, I don't know the exact significance of all of them, but it seems to be a very significant section, very important section. I do encourage you to look at it. There's again, like I mentioned earlier about the unidentified glosses. What caught my eye in this section is the Chafetz Chaim, or Chaim Vital Sefer, the Chafetz Chaim, lot 102. Lot 102, it's the Chafetz Chaim edition from Harab Shav. And this, it says that there's many, many glosses in an unidentified hand, with showing great expertise in Kabbalah and Yonim. So that's very intriguing. There are people who are expert in these things. They can probably shed a lot of light on some of that. So I think that should take a look at that.
Right, and the Tanya I'll mention is lot 90, 91, 92. So there's a number, those I'll mention them, and there's a number of other Hasidic Shram. And like I mentioned, it's kind of like weird. You have like Tanya, and then you end up with Sefer Haggai, and the Ramchal. The next one, it's kind of all mixed together. And again, just seeing how it's mixed up and jumping again to 115, you have a Sidrei Taras on Kalim and all this. You have the Gemara on Taras, and
this is only Hasidic because it was written by a Hasidic Rebbe.
Exactly.
But more than a Hasidic Rebbe, the author of the Sidrei Taras, the Radziner, was just an absolute genius, a brilliant, multifaceted genius. Once in a generation kind of genius he was, and the things he's done in a short lifetime too. He passed away. He was only 52 years old. We all know him for the Tchelis campaign. The Tchelis he undertook at the end of his life. Before that, he was just a massive, massive genius. Talmud Chacham, mastering all of Torah, all of Hasidus, of course, and Jewish thought. He wrote very extensively on Gemara, on Drushes, and he wrote the Sidrei Taras, which we have on Kalim and on Eihalas, is only part of what he did. He did it on the whole Taharis, and these are monumental volumes. So this is, we're talking about a rare genius, and this idea itself is genius too. To put together a Gemara where none existed on Kalim and Eihalas, it's absolute brilliant stuff. Of course, it was very earned the high respect of the Rabban of the generation. He has fantastic haskamas from everybody as far away as Bavel. The Bezdin in Bavel gave him a haskama. It's a real unique work. Now, the Shoel Meshach has a very long haskama there where he feels like he has to justify the idea of creating a Gemara where none existed before. He says that his ancestor, the Maharal, had already done that, but he wrote on Taharis, a Gemara on Taharis, which was lost to the fire. He says he himself did it. Shoel Meshach himself says he wrote on Kalim, but didn't publish it once, knowing that the Maharal, his ancestor, didn't publish it, he didn't publish it either. He does talk about the existence of Reb Shlomo Sirilio's Yerushalmi, not Yerushalmi, but his Gemara on Adius, which I think at the time was in manuscript, but today it has been published by Avat Shalom. So it's quite a work, quite a unique, fascinating, and monumental work. And just I remember when I first came across this as a yeshiva bacher, and it blew my mind. I did notice that in the second volume it says Melukat Midivrei Tanom V'Ameroim, and I learned that the first volume there was some blowback about creating a Gemara where none existed. You're creating an impression that it's an actual Gemara. People wouldn't know that it's not a Gemara. I'm not sure what the great drawback is there. Is that just going to lengthen the Daf Yomi cycle? I'm not sure what we're worried about. But the fact of the matter was, to appease them, the son who did publish the second volume posthumously added that little disclaimer on the bottom of every single page. It's stamped. That's Melukim Medirat Tanav Amiram. This Sefer was republished again in 1961, a photo offset by the Radziner's nephew, or Yerucham Liner, a very colorful person, Talmud Chacham himself. And he writes that he was lucky to have an original because there was a great fire in the Radziner city, and all of his voluminous writings went up in smoke, as well as many, the published farm as well. Whatever they had in the inventory was gone. So it's somewhat of a rare, to find the originals, I think, are somewhat rare. But here they are in lot 115. Very interesting.
Okay, now lot 122 is what the printed catalog actually put it on the back cover, is the famous Zera Shimshon, Rabbi Shimshon Chaim Nachmani of Italy. It was printed in Mantua, 1778, the famous Gula with the Sefer. Many are familiar today. There's many different various new editions. So this is it, and it's in a beautiful leather binding. I'll just mention, they do bring down the Skula in there. I'll just mention, even though it's not the lot, but being that it's Pirkei Avos time now, it's between Pesach and Shavuos. He also wrote another sefer called Talmud Shimshon. I'm not sure why. I mean, listeners can correct me. It's not as famous for some reason as Machon HaItzer, and there's another one as well. But I have the Itzer one. It's a beautiful new edition. Nice, basic notes, no major commentary. It's a very nice Pirush and Pirkei Avos. And he actually says the same thing. Actually, just to read a little bit from his Pirkei Avos, he says, "V'yan, you should know he called Toldos Cheserin, all the." He told us, listen, his one son died, and he has no children. So he's saying this is his children, this commentary. And he says, I'm not nafshi ksivis Yohav Ba'at Barzli wrote it. So we should say my name. You should mention my name after I die. Kasher be'eser l'shoneh shel tefillah ni mechala paneim. Ba'ala gmul yishalem b'meitav chai yirichem mizoni tefillah gud l'chazem toiv. When he says Hashem should pay you back. Now he is stronger in his Zera Shimshon. I believe he promises more. Ba'ala gmul yishalem b'schus zeh schar toiv l'gud l'chazem shel emes. But Moses flasa bani chai mizoni toiv. But I don't have it in front of me. I think they bring the catalog. He does promise more. Really promises children. The whole segula. But he does say in Talmud Shimshon as well. Also learning his farm, and it's a really interesting commentary in Pirkei Avos. Anyways, that's how the Zera Shimshon. Zera Shimshon is the more famous one, but just to mention that.
But maybe look out for a first print Talmud Shimshon in a future auction. Who knows? Maybe Nachi, you will be instrumental in the next new segula. But I can't imagine how many first prints of Zera Shimshon still did. The great popularity that it enjoys today. It was not historically a famous sefer at all. How many first prints can still be in existence? I mean, this is I imagine it's a rare item. I expect there will be a lot of interest in this item.
Okay, then just jumping through, there's some Haggadahs over here. There's the Haggadah Shel Pesach of lot 139, the Master Rabbi Lazar of Rabbi Lazar Fleckles, which has been redone, but I think this was the last Haggadah published in Hungary before the Holocaust in 1944. Interesting. Lot 144 is, I don't know, maybe listeners can know more about it. It's Haggadah Shel Pesach from Shivas Ben Chaim Berlin before Rav Hutner. It's a parody trying to collect money. They just bring a little bit in the description here, and they say Marar, it's bitter and hard to keep on the existence of the yeshiva. They bring the simanim in Yiddish. They're writing it here, so it's not in Yiddish. I'm just going to read from they're writing in the catalog. They wrote a acrostic. Yeshiva Ben Chaim Berlin darf haben Geld. They need money. It's like again. I don't have more of the sample like that. I can't see what it is. It's not expensive. It's an interesting looking thing. If someone's interested in something like that, and then there's various. They have a section titled Sfarim with signatures and glosses. So there's obviously, if you want to collect Sfarim with signatures, it's actually interesting. Lot 148. Meir Orbach, the author of the Imrei Bina, gave a copy of the Imrei Bina to Rabbi Zichron Inspector, and it has the stamps of the Kav Nakol. It's pretty interesting. There's various others. Lot 152 is the Chafetz Chaim. Actually, it's interesting, this one, a lot of the Chafetz Chaim say Muga. Here they actually find there's a small handwritten correction by the Chafetz Chaim. And then 153 is Likutei Halach, Hashlam Likutei Halach, and there it says Muga. It's interesting that the Chafetz Chaim, I don't think it actually says Muga. I guess the reason why is because he has a handwritten correction. It wasn't Muga. Even though they wrote Muga and all that. Sorry, here you get one that's not Muga. It's actually interesting. You actually have the correction from him. So there's that. Just again, just flipping through, just a lot 157. They have the Rameshigans. They read the Father Rikve Eger on the Sefer Alachem upon him. I don't really have much to add on that, but lot 158 is a very interesting thing. It's a very interesting story. It's interesting. I'll say it's not going for a lot of money. It's a beautiful leather binding. It's not going for a lot of money here. Interestingly, and there's what to talk about on this. So Ramesh, I'll give the floor to you.
Yeah, lot 158 is the Sedei Yitzchak of Rabbi Yitzchak Guita. Rabbi Yitzchak Guita was born in Libya. There's a legend. There's a famous legend, famous in certain parts of the world anyway, where surrounding his rise to greatness. He was a simple shamish, they say, Yankala the shamish, simple shamish, and for a wealthy homeowner in his hometown in Libya, not a very learned fellow. This is the legend. This is how the legend goes. Not a learned fellow, but a very trusting and honest fellow. And through some, humorous act, he was persuaded to donate all his life savings to a passing shliach who was collecting money for the shadar for Eretz Yisrael. He gave all his earnings to that shadar, and the shadar thereby blessed him and said, "You should be even wealthier than your boss." And that blessing came true tenfold, and he became fabulously wealthy. And once he became wealthy, then he was able to hire tutors, and he was able to learn, and became Torah Gdul b'makam echad. So the legend goes. I have my doubts about it. Because first of all, he had some detractors, as people naturally jealous of a person of great learning and great wealth. So he had his detractors. There was one detractor I'll mention in a moment who actually published a work against him. So it could be that they were the ones who wanted to stress his humble background. Rav Meir Mazuz mentions that his father, Matzliach Mazuz, wouldn't even take the Sefer seriously because of this because of this story. He's like, yeah, he was really a simpleton who just was able to rise the ranks of Torah scholarship, but not actually one of the great Torah scholars. But the Meir Mazuz actually demurs and says, no, I think it's used by a lot, like Rav Palachi quotes it and others quote it's actually a good Sefer. To me personally, my personal estimation of the Sefer, for what it's worth, I think it's a very original Sefer. I tend to find that these Torah Gdula types, they don't have to prove themselves in the Beis Medrash by going the well-trodden road of Pilpul and out being Mefalpel and becoming bigger and better Chidushim and following the mold, so to speak. But they can actually be more original. And I find that like Rav Yudel Epstein in his Minchas Yehuda, which is a very original Sefer. He was a very wealthy man and brisk, who also was a great Talmud Chacham, and he wrote his Agoyes on Shas, the Minchas Yehuda. Very fascinating Sefer, full of interesting insights, very original. There's an emphasis on history and the chain of transmission, and it focuses on very interesting things. The Rashash, famously, Rashash was independently wealthy, and he set about writing his own kind of comments on Shas, which were not, the kind of kashas and tourism you find in others farm, but we now have a great appreciation for the Rashash's Hagoyes because they're so original, and they're so incisive, and they're terrific. So I find sometimes that the people who rise to greatness with the Torah Gdul, with the express a certain kind of originality, and I find this Sedei Yitzchak is actually a very interesting Sefer. What's unique, and this is as a bibliophile, you may find this interesting. The Sefer is printed on fabulously expensive paper, and the ink it was done because he was a very wealthy person. Rabbi Yitzchak Guita, he published it. He spared no expense, and the Sefer it's a beautiful. The originals are just fantastically beautiful. Even the reprint was also very, very nice. That Abba Shalom condensed the 4 volumes of the 2. When they reprinted it, they just did a photo offset because it's a really very high quality print, very high quality Sefer. I mentioned before his snaglis to him. It's really interesting, and this is very timely as well because we just read in the Parsha about the grasshoppers in Parsha Shmini, where we read about the grasshoppers that can be eaten if they possess the right simonim. We all know the story of Chaim Kanievsky and the grasshopper, but that's not the first time the story happened. In the Sedei Yitzchak on Chul and Daf Nun Tes, he mentions how he was studying the Rashi, and there's a problematic Rashi which describes the different legs and the wings, and it didn't make any sense to him. And he said, as he's pondering this, now he writes that this story happened in his youth, which kind of also dispels the notion that he did not learn in his youth. He said he was learning in his youth this and he was pondering this Rashi, and then what happened? right then and there, a grasshopper flew down and landed on his page. And he picked up the grasshopper with his hands, and he was able to study it and examine it and figure out the Pshat and Rashi. And he held the grasshopper, he put it away and brought it into the Beis Medrash the next day. He brought it to his Rebbe, and his Rebbe verified, yes, that you arrived at the right Pshat because of this Rashi. Now, his detractor was a fellow also by the name of Lutzato, Aaron Lutzato. This is in the city where Rabbi Yitzchak lived in Trieste, Italy. Over there, and he wrote a acerbic kuntras against Rabbi Yitzchak, which he called by Yistabel HaChagav, referencing this story that happened with the grasshopper, and he just heaps on him and denigrates him. So he had his detractors. That's my point. But I think Kodev and Kodev Munach, I think it's an interesting sefer. This is volume 1 of the sefer, and lot 158. I think listeners and buyers and bibliophiles will find this to be a very interesting sefer.
Yeah, lot 162 just was like funny to me. It's like a Kingdom of Kahana by Victor Miller, and a picture of a little yellow postcard. Bracha v'atzlacha, Rabbi Miller. I guess it wasn't only Reb Chaim, it said Bua. You can have your Victor Miller in your kapaya, so it says Bua.
We're finding that a lot of Reb Chaim Kanievsky lore is really sourced in earlier sources.
It's interesting. Yeah, there's an interesting lot 164 is just interesting. Another signature. It's the Rogachover, Savas Paneach, when he himself has an inscription for his father-in-law. So that's, but it's partially cut off, unfortunately. But that's another interesting inscription. Now, then we get up to the section rabbinical letters and manuscripts. So letters is a kind of a whole different thing than Svarim, but we'll mention some of the letters. And letters, again, is interesting. Just if you're interested, just to own the catalog, because you get to see the letters. Many of them, not all of them, are reproduced in full, so you can kind of see those. So first,
and again, I'll just mention here, the catalog is not they don't. If you have a knack for history and reading these letters, and you like the finer nuances, it's worth reading these letters because the catalog just gives a brief description. I'll take a line or two out of it, but I really enjoy reading them and finding little tidbits, and maybe I'll point out some of them as we go on. But there's a lot to be learned from these letters if you'll sit down and read them. And I want to mention one sad note here on page 173. This is the Saba Kadisha 173, lot 173. It's a page of Chidushei Torah from the Saba Kadisha. I say sad because we know that right after the Saba Kadisha passed away in the 1930s in Yerushalmi, there were kol koros going out about how all his writings were looted. And this looks to be like a page from a notebook, which was apparently taken apart, and this individual leaf shows up here. It's sad because he was such a Mayan Hamizgaber. He was revered by so many different factions as a real throwback to a different generation, and what a guy he was. And we have very little Torah from him because it was all taken away. So this one page here, which is now being returned, hopefully maybe there's more. I hope they're not just selling one page at a time. Hopefully this can lead us maybe to returning to restoring the glory of the Saba Kadisha. 175, item 175 is a letter from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, which is fascinating because this is Shlomo Zalman Auerbach writing to a younger Talmud Chacham, Rabbi Butchakovsky, who wrote a sefer on Tyrus, and Shlomo Zalman has a question for him about something he saw in the sefer, which was to him a question about a certain sugi about the clay glolim. Can we paskin? He asked Rabbi Butchakovsky, can we paskin like a chiddush that they say over from Reb Chaim and stencils? He says you would know, and he said apparently they had already corresponded on this before, and then Shlomo Zalman says, and I have to tell you, zois l'moydei shel tzayri, you make a very big mistake in attributing my asking you to my humility. It's not humility at all. What I wrote to you is absolutely true. I never learned Masechet Vayholos. I just looked here and there, but I never actually learned it. So I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking I too am guilty of Rabbi Butchakovsky's mistake, and I also think I detect a hint of humility here. But this is Rosh Zalman's a rear. This is what made Rosh Zalman so beloved on everybody. His openness and his candor and of course his humility. A fascinating letter from Rosh Zalman Arba.
That's on 175, and like you said, it's interesting. They just put in the quote, "I have never learned Masechet Olis." They leave at the beginning. They kind of just in the letter, but you can read the letter. It's actually reproduced here. It's
fascinating,
very interesting. And then we come to, I guess, the most interesting item in the auction, the most infamous, which is number one, lot 177. And I'll read what they wrote. It says, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, original letter from the Cherem Keniza, Mezhbush, 1748. Now, the problem with this description, obviously, is that the Cherem Keniza is most probably a forgery and is not real. I hope I didn't offend too many Lubavitcher Hasidim listening to this when I say that. But Ramesh, let me talk about the Cherem Keniza and this letter here.
Now, the Cherem Keniza went through some progressions. When it was first discovered in the early 1900s, it was presented as the original archive of these Hasidic masters' writings, 300 or so letters, a very, very large amount of letters and writings, and even Svarim and some artifacts were included in the so-called Geniza, which they said came from the city of Kherson, which we know it's in the news now, it's in Ukraine. And this Geniza it came with a story of how it got there. It went through the Baal Shem Tov's grandchildren, eventually landing by the originator, where it was confiscated by the Russians, and to authenticate this claim that it was confiscated by the Russians, these items included stamps and Russian wordings, numbering the items and listing them as being part of the investigation. So it first came to light as if it was the original archive. Now, scholars right away jumped in and they seized it. They found the handwritings are similar. They don't look like the ancient handwritings. They tested the paper chemically. They did tests on them. They said this is not paper from the 1700s or even from the early 1800s. So then the story was changed some to say that, no, these are not the originals. These are copies, of the originals. And he said, if you're going to point to a specific letter and say that's not an original, fine. It's simply a copy. Reb David Tzvi Hillman, the late Reb David Tzvi Hillman, a very critical and brilliant researcher. As a young man in 1953, he published an authoritative collection of letters of the Alter Rebbe, Igres Baal Tanya Ubnei Doirei, and at the end, he devoted a section to the letters of the Baal Tanya that are sourced in the Cherem Geniza, and he listed all his tainas, and he does a devastating job on the Cherem Geniza, pointing out where the dates are mistaken. He found trends. He says, notice, none of the letters have dates of the month. They're always the day. Gimel Parshas Vayeshev. Why are there no dates of the months? Because that's too hard for the forgers to verify that, go look up the ancient calendars and make sure they didn't fall out on Shabbos or Yom Tov. He says, notice how there's none of those days are ever fall out on these specific parashas, which are typically Yom Tov parashas. They didn't want to run it afoul. He found a lot of trends. He found a mention of a Sefer of the Rambam, the Tshuvos of the Rambam, where it refers to the Tshuvos of the Rambam as Kovetz Tshuvos HaRambam, Chelik Beis, Simin Chav Beis. He says the only volume of the Rambam's Tshuvos that were called Kovetz Tshuvos HaRambam was printed in 1859. Before that, they had a lot of different other names. There was never Kovetz Tshuvos HaRambam is the Leipzig print of the Rambam, and that's the only one that's divided into sections where you can talk about Chelik this, Chelik that. A lot of internal problems he found, and it's a devastating job. It convinced almost everybody, but Lubavitchers, like you said, they take it as a matter of faith. The Rayats believe these letters to be authentic, even if they're not the originals, but he believes they are copies of authentic material. He says there's Torah in there. Now, one of Tzvi Hillman's problems he says, how could it be that in all these letters there's no Torah? At most, there's 3 lines, 4 lines, but there's no heavy Torah there. It's just because these forgers were just not on the level to be able to forge Torah. But either way, that's Reb Tzvi Hillman's position. But the Rebbe Rayats believed that things which he had known only through tradition, which were never publicized, he found authentication of them in these letters. So he believed these letters are true, and because he believed it's true, so the Menachem Mendel, the last Rebbe, also fought very hard to defend the authenticity of these letters. So till this very day, it's a matter of faith for Lubavitcher Chassidim to treat these letters as authentic, and so that's I believe that's why this catalog does not take sides. It says it lays out the story, but whatever it is, this letter, whether it's the Baal Shem Tov's original letter, it's a copy of the Baal Shem Tov's original letter, or it's a forgery like the Yerushalmi and Kachim. It's just a fascinating historical piece, very, very rare piece. It's reproduced here, the picture of it with the Russian stamp on it. Fascinating historical piece. Definitely. I don't know how many times these kind of things show up in auction. Definitely check out lot 177.
Yeah, I think Feivel Schneider told me that the last time a letter from the Chassidinis of Kimmel Mokher was 5-10 years ago. I didn't check, but it was a while ago. So this letter actually was printed. It's a Sefer de Genuza in 1921. It's been printed before, but a fascinating story. It's a fascinating thing. Check out that letter. Now, another letter. Moshe, you want to talk about another letter, I think.
Yeah, this is another, a little postscript that caught my eye in actually a typewritten letter from Rebbe Meir Bloch of the Tel Yeshiva. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of the new Tel Yeshiva in Cleveland. This letter is in 1949, shortly after the war, shortly after he starts the yeshiva. And it's written to Rabbi Menachem Parish. And it's fascinating because he talks about in these early years of the Tel Yeshiva in Cleveland, they were already thinking about branching out and starting a yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael. And they wrote to Rabbi Menachem Parish of the Aguda, for his help. He says, Rabbi Chaim Mordechai Katz is on his way to Eretz Yisrael. Please meet him. Let's see if we can, do something more for the Kedoshei Tells and perpetuate the legacy. Now, I say it's interesting because, the facsimile of the letter is right here in the catalog. And I see the postscript on the bottom there's a handwritten postscript. I read that. And Rebbe Meir tells Rabbi Nachman Parish, he says, I already subscribed to Hamavaser, and in Mirz Hashem, Bli Neder, I will send you the dues soon for this, for Hamavaser. So I know that Hamavaser is, Rabbi Menachem Parish is, he was the editor of such a periodical for the Aguda, but I did not know that it was in existence in 1949. I searched and I found that the earliest record is 1950, so maybe he pre-subscribed, or maybe there's earlier copies that we don't know about anymore. But I found it to be very, very interesting.
There's a lot. There's many more letters and Dvar Torah, for example, lot. I believe it is lot 186 is bound in a leather binding. This Xavier Moshe from Igros Moshe. I think it's 10 pages. Very long. It has a whole leather binding. That's 186. And
I'll say one thing about lot 186 that caught my eye. I once heard B'Shem Reuven Feinstein that he says he never saw his father cross anything else. Moshe Feinstein was such a goyin, such full command of his intellectual capacities that he would just write, and he did. And it's astonishing the output that Moshe has, and even in these letters. So that jumped up at me right away. I wanted to look at these letters which are produced here. Are there any crossouts? And there are actually some. So that's an exaggeration, of course. There are some crossouts, but nothing major. He didn't have to take out a line or a paragraph, a word or two here or there. But he did write like a endless fountain that he was.
Yeah, many other letters. I'll mention lot 207 is Rebbeinu Minsker. It's on a postcard, the Yonis Elim. People very, very familiar with. Again, this. I was told that it's rare. I don't know. I'm just repeating what I was told. Now, there's a very, very, very interesting letter. Lot 212 about the Aderet, from the Aderet. And they're blurred part of the letter out, actually. So most of the letters are reproduced in full. You can see the whole thing. This one, they kind of tease. They kind of...
Although online, the actual... I guess maybe there's rights or there's other concerns why they blurred here, but... On the online version, you can read the whole letter, and I did. They teased it here in the catalog, saying that the Adaris writes here that he was against publishing the Sefer of the Chuvas Maharil Diskin, but they did publish it anyway with his Askama. So I wanted to just get the fuller idea of what was going on here. The letter seems to me, and they say this as well in the catalog, that it's not the full letter. It seems to start in the middle. It's on one page of the Adaris stationery. Apparently, there was an earlier page as well. But you can pretty much get the story from this page, which is signed. It has his signature. For those, for value seekers, the signature is, of course, very valuable. So, but the letter is interesting. The letter, to me, now we don't have the first page here, but to me it seems pretty clear that he's writing this to the Maharil Diskin's son, or his only son, Yitzchak Yerucham Diskin. And apparently, the tone is, it's apologetic. It seems like Yitzchak Yerucham had says, I didn't want, nobody ran it by me to publish my father's Chidushim. Why did you send? Why did you support it with your haskama? So I think this is written after the Sefer is already published, and the Adaris responds to him. He says, I thought it was fishy when I saw it, and I told them then that they have to have the family's approval. they can never do something, and he writes a very interesting lashon. He says they can never do something neged kavod b'nai yechidah. They can never do something that's against the honor of his own son, umaylas b'nei mishpacha, and his family. And he adds hanoi das l'tehila b'yerusam u'ashram. They can't do anything against Rabbi Yitzchak Yerucham's family, who are famous for their Yerushalmi, which they were, and their wealth, which they were. Rabbi Yitzchak Yerucham Diskin, his wife was very independently wealthy. He came to Yerushalayim, did not need the chalukah. He was an independently wealthy person. So, there it says nobody would ever do anything against the honor of his distinguished family, who's well known for their piety and their wealth. So there suggests. I suggest, he says, please don't bother me about this anymore. He says, I just gave to make kadima, which is, and it's true. I looked at the Askama. He's just saying it's a wonderful thing to have, and I will also buy the Sefer when it comes out. And he writes as much to Daris in this letter. I didn't really give them permission. My Askama was just applauding the effort to publish the Torah and committing to buy a copy when it comes out. For more information, please, I don't know anything about this. Please see Reb Tzvi Michal Shapiro. He was the one who was behind it. And he said, I don't know Reb Tzvi Michal's address, but write to Reb Chaim Zonenfeld. He writes it in Rosh Tevis, Reish Ches Zayin Fei, which is Reb Chaim Zonenfeld. He says, write to Reb Chaim Zonenfeld because they live in the same chutzner. So I don't know if that was known before or not, but he says that's Daris's his advice. Write to him, take it up with him, but please leave me out of this. I have nothing more to add.
I want to jump ahead to a bit of a funny letter. Lot 230 is a letter from the in another Yerushalayim story from the Brisker Rav. It says Lachav Harav Salavechik Zev Rechov Press Yeshaya 3, and it's a letter that Tinale Yadiacha Ki Eter Lachav Vesecha Ba'adar Nona. Basically, you own municipal taxes, and we're going to put a lien in your property if you don't pay it. And so it's a funny. It's only from the Brisker Rav sign on here, but it's a letter to the Brisker Rav threatening him unless he pays the taxes.
Yeah, it is. This reminds me of a joke, which will be politically correct. We'll try, as we say over this joke. There was an episode where a certain religious group felt offended by a certain publication, and the religious group went on a violent rampage, looting and destroying and putting human life at peril, and trying to, the building that was the source of the publication was also threatened and attacked. And somebody made the joke at the time that if it had been a Jewish people that had been offended, they wouldn't attack anybody. They would just buy the building, rezone it, and sell it for 10 times its value. So that's kind of what happened here. Here they're threatening the Brisker Rav with eviction, and the Brisker Rav had the last laugh because Rechov Press 3 has been bought by his children, and that is the address of the Brisker Yeshiva. So they thought they were going to evict him, and who had the last laugh?
Yeah, it's a funny letter. It says last lot 230. Interested in seeing it for that letter.
Right before that, in lot 226, is a very, again, a letter of great historical interest as well. It's a valuable letter. It has the signature of Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, Spector, the Gadol Hador and Covenant in Europe, and it also has a rare signature of Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, the Rav HaKoil in New York. So besides for being a valuable letter with these valuable signatures, it also gives you a sense of the kind of challenges that rabbis have to deal with, with the mass migration to the New World. This is a letter written by one Rav about a husband who had emigrated to Chicago, leaving behind the woman in Aguna. He writes to Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan. Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan adds his plea for the Rabbanon to please get involved and get a get from this man. They send this letter now to New York across the ocean, and Rabbi Yaakov Yosef joins in on the call to galvanize Rabbanon to do something. So this is the kind of challenges they dealt with, and this is the way their multi-continental efforts at meeting these challenges.
I want to mention that lot 241, 242, and 243 are these big collections of letters. I have no idea what the methodology here was and how they put these together. 241 is historic collection of 28 letters by the Rabbanim of Lodz. 242 historic collection of 38 letters by various Rabbanim. So I have no idea what went into that. And 243 is a lot of 47 letters by Rabbanim. So I'm not sure this is like a catalogue. I don't know, but it's like they kind of put these big collections together. Lot 245 of Herman Struck, the artist. You can get 6 kind of lithographs. Tivol Nagarni, Bekiv Eger, B'Chaim Spector, Chaim Salveitche, Leo Gutmacher, Yaakov Reines. Kind of interesting kind of collection.
Yeah, it shows you who is who. One last letter that caught my eye in this letter section in lot 228 is a letter from Blazer Silver. There's an earlier lot with a lot of letters from Blazer Silver, but this tiny letter, very, very interesting to me. It's a tshuva that he wrote on a business card. I have another one. I found one in the library, which I copied, and I hope to publish once. A tshuva that he wrote on a train, where he writes, "I'm on a train to Washington on a Hatzalah mission." But he had his business card with him, and he writes the tshuva on the back of the business card. So that's what we have here. We have here a tshuva that he wrote on the business card. In the description does not do justice to the letter. The description says it has something to do with shechita. It doesn't really have anything to do with shechita. It seems to be a comment on something that Blazer Silver was working on his own Sefer. It's about something in a planned chelik shlishi, and the comment has to do with something that Blazer Silver had to clarify that the egla arufa, the arifa of the egla arufa can be done with a zar. It does not have to be done with a kohen, just like shechita. That's where the word shechita got in there. And then he writes on the back of the letter, fascinating thing. He says, "I got to tell you the truth." He says, "When I was sick, I lost volume shlishi, the third volume of his Sefer, Anfeyeres." He said, "I have lost it, and I'm writing it over from fresh, from letters." He says, "Ches to Yud," which is true. I checked it up on my Anfeyeres. Volume 2 goes up through Zion. The next volume was going to be Ches and on. He says, "I'm writing that all from memory," and he says, "Gosh, it's harder to write over old stuff than to learn new stuff." He admits that. So it's very of great historical interest, and of course, this is the personality of Blazer Silver writing a tshuva on the back of a business card. Fascinating to me.
Yeah, and the other letters of Blazer Silver, there's 11 letters. It's lot 225, and there's many more letters. Like I said, so a couple of things here as we kind of wrap up. I think we ran pretty long, but this is. I think it was interesting. It was interesting to me to see the catalog and to go through it because, first of all, again, the episode was sponsored by Legacy Judaica, and it was interesting because they sponsored it. They brought me the catalog, and I kind of went through it to kind of prepare for the episode. I think actually you did as well. You really went through it, and it was interesting to see when you have to actually go through and you sit there. There's a lot of really fascinating things just to see it, even if some of these items, most of these items, I would never bid on or purchase any of these, and maybe listeners as well, but I think it's of historical interest. It's interesting for those to see and to purchase. I think it's just to see the catalog. And check out the show's notes. So I'll put a link in there that you can go check out. Like I said, I'll try to link to all the items. We talk about a lot of items. I don't know if I'll be able to link to all the items. Maybe some of them, more interesting ones, whatever. But definitely I'll link to it. You can check it out on BidSpirit, Legacy Judaica. Their website kind of links to BidSpirit as well. And the auction is, again, April 23rd at 1 p.m. And you can attend live. If you want to attend live, in Estreia, in Lakewood, which I believe is 978 River Avenue. Anyone in Lakewood is familiar with, it seems like countless brisson that are there and Vart and things like that. So, with that, Ramesha, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. Always an enlightening experience. Always very grateful to talk to your audience, your learned audience, appreciative audience about things that we love. And I hope you find it interesting as well. I wish you all well, and I wish a lot of success to Legacy Judaica as well as all the listeners and all their individual endeavors.
And again, thank you to Legacy Judaica for sponsoring this. And listeners, what did you think of the episode? What did you think of this format? What did you think of our more conversational, throwing out random tidbits? Let me know. Please let me know. Svarimchatter@gmail.com.